The tag on my chest didn't say my name. It said, housekeeper, clipped neatly onto my dress like someone had decided my place for me before I even walked through the door. And when I looked up, my mother-in-law was smiling, like this was perfectly normal, and said, "Oh, don't worry, it suits you," while adjusting it as if she were fixing a wrinkle. And I felt the room shift as people started noticing, whispering, not loudly but enough. And then Daniel leaned close to my ear and murmured, "Just go with it, Isabella. Don't make this awkward, like I was the problem, like I was the one causing a scene." And when I whispered back, "Is this a joke?" he didn't even look at me, just straightened his cuff and said, "It's my sister's night, don't ruin it." And that was the moment something inside me went completely still, not broken, not loud, just quiet, in a way that felt permanent, because I realized this wasn't a mistake, this was planned, this was allowed, and every person in that room was choosing to see me this way, choosing not to correct it, choosing to let me stand there labeled like I didn't belong, like I had never belonged. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe, and maybe tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because I remember exactly what time it was for me when everything changed. My name is Isabella Cruz, I'm 32 years old, and this was the night my husband's family showed me exactly who I was to them, and where everything I thought I had built quietly started to fall apart. But to understand how I ended up standing in that ballroom wearing someone else's label, you have to go back to where it started, to the small things I ignored, the comments I let slide, the moments that didn't feel right but never felt big enough to confront, because nothing about that night was sudden. It was just the first time they stopped hiding it. The ballroom itself was exactly what you'd expect for a Whitmore event. Tall ceilings, crystal chandeliers, everything polished to the point where it almost didn't feel real, and I stood there in heels I'd chosen carefully, a dress I'd paid for myself, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't taken a sip from, because suddenly my hands felt too noticeable, like anything I did would confirm the role they had assigned me. And across the room, Daniel's sister laughed loudly, showing off her engagement ring to a group of women who leaned in like it was the most important thing in the world. And I watched Daniel walk over to them, slipping easily into their circle like I wasn't standing just 10 feet away, like I wasn't supposed to be next to him. And when I finally stepped closer, one of his cousins glanced at my tag and said, "Oh good, can you grab us more drinks?" Not even mean, just certain, like it made sense. And I paused, just for a second, and Daniel saw it. He saw everything, and instead of correcting her, instead of saying my name, he just gave me a look, that same look he always gave when he wanted me to behave, and said quietly, "Please don't make this a thing." And I felt my throat tighten, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I suddenly understood that saying anything wouldn't matter, that this wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about permission, and they had all agreed on who I was allowed to be tonight, and maybe for a long time before that. And I turned slightly, scanning the room, taking in the details I had noticed before in a completely different way, the layout, the lighting, the way the staff moved through the space, efficient, invisible, expected not to exist beyond their function. And for a brief second, something didn't line up, something about the way one of the event managers glanced at me and then quickly looked away, like he recognized me but didn't understand why I was standing there like that. And I felt that quiet shift again, deeper this time, because suddenly I wasn't just hurt. I was aware of every choice being made around me, every silence, every small act of dismissal. And I heard my mother-in-law again behind me, speaking to someone else. "She keeps herself busy with little projects," she said lightly, like she was explaining a harmless hobby. And I stood there, listening, feeling that sentence settle into place with everything else I had ignored over the years. The dinners where I wasn't asked questions, the conversations where my work was brushed aside, the way Daniel never corrected them, never filled in the gaps, never told them who I really was. And I realized in that moment that the version of me they believed in wasn't accidental. It had been built slowly, carefully, with my silence and his agreement. And as I looked down at that tag again, at the word housekeeper printed in clean black letters, I felt something else underneath the hurt. Something steadier, something that had been there long before this night, long before I met Daniel, something they had never seen. And as I lifted my eyes back to the room, to the people who thought they understood exactly who I was, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had no idea what they had just done, and more importantly, they had no idea who they had just humiliated, and the reason they didn't know was something that had been hidden in plain sight the entire time. I grew up learning how to take up less space than I needed, and it did not happen all at once. It happened in small, quiet moments that no one ever called out, like the first time Daniel's mother looked at me across her dining table and said, "You are very simple, Isabella," with a smile that sounded like a compliment but landed somewhere else entirely. And I remember glancing down at my blouse, wondering what part of me she had already decided did not belong in her world. And Daniel had just laughed softly and squeezed my hand under the table, whispering, "She does not mean anything by it." Like that made it easier. Like that explained why I kept feeling smaller every time I walked into that house. And it became a pattern after that, a rhythm I learned to follow. Sunday dinners where his sister talked about her internships in Manhattan while I passed plates, his brother discussing investments I was never asked about, and me sitting there waiting for a question that never came. And when I tried once, just once, to share something about my work, I remember his father cutting in gently but firmly, "That sounds nice, but Daniel, tell us about your promotion again." And just like that, the conversation moved on without me, like I had never spoken at all. And later in the car, I turned to Daniel and said, "Do they even know what I do?" And he kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the steering wheel, the other tapping lightly against his thigh, and said, "They just need time. They are used to a certain kind of life." And I remember asking, "And I am not part of that life?" And he paused just long enough for me to notice before saying, "It is not like that." But he did not explain what it was like, and I stopped asking after that, because every answer felt like it came with a quiet request for me to adjust, to soften, to be less. And I told myself it was temporary, that once they got to know me, things would change, that if I just stayed patient, stayed kind, stayed easy to accept, they would eventually see me. But looking back now, I realized they did see me. They just saw exactly what they expected to see, and I helped them believe it. I made it easier for them by not correcting it, by not insisting, by letting Daniel introduce me however he wanted, which was usually something like, "This is Isabella. She keeps things running at home," said casually. Like it was enough, like it covered everything. And I remember the first time he said that at a small dinner with his coworkers. I laughed it off, even added, "Someone has to keep him organized," because it felt easier than correcting him in front of people, easier than explaining the truth. And afterward, I told myself it was not a big deal, that labels did not matter, that what we had privately was more important than what people saw. But those moments stacked quietly, one on top of another, until they became something solid, something that shaped the way people looked at me before I even opened my mouth. And there were signs, clear ones, that I chose not to follow, like the time his sister handed me her coat at a holiday party without even looking at me and said, "Can you hang this up?" And I took it without thinking, walked to the hallway, and only realized what had happened when I saw an actual staff member standing there doing the same thing. And she looked at me with a brief, confused expression before taking the coat from my hands. And I stood there for a second, unsure whether to laugh or feel embarrassed. And when I went back inside, Daniel just smiled and said, "You are too nice sometimes," like kindness was the reason, like it was not something deeper. Something about how I had been positioned in that space without ever agreeing to it. And I started noticing the details more after that. The way his mother would assign me small tasks during gatherings. "Can you check on the kitchen?" Or, "Make sure the candles are lit," always said politely, always with that same controlled tone that made it sound reasonable. And I did it, because saying no felt like making a scene. And making a scene was the one thing Daniel always asked me not to do. "Just keep things smooth," he would say. "It is easier that way." And I believed him. I believed that peace came from staying quiet, from choosing not to challenge the roles people placed on you. And for a while, it worked, or at least it felt like it did, because there was no conflict, no confrontation, just a steady, quiet acceptance of something I could not quite name. And then there were the moments that almost broke through, the ones that made me pause, like the night I overheard his mother on the phone in the next room saying, "She is harmless. She does not complicate things." And I remember standing there, my hand resting on the doorframe, feeling that word settle in a way I could not shake. Harmless, like I was something that existed around their lives, not within them. and I wanted to walk in, to say something, to ask what exactly I was to them, but I did not. I stepped back instead, moved quietly so she would not know I had heard, and that was the moment, I think, when something began to change. Not in them, but in me, because for the first time, I stopped assuming that this was temporary. I stopped believing that time would fix something that no one else saw as broken. And even then, I did not act on it. I did not confront Daniel. I did not draw a line. I just carried that awareness with me, letting it sit quietly in the background, shaping the way I saw things, without changing how I responded, until that night, the engagement, where everything that had been subtle became visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore, and standing there with that tag on my chest, I realized something else, something that had been there all along but had never fully surfaced, because the truth was not just that they did not see me, it was that Daniel had made sure they never needed to, and that realization, quiet as it was, felt like the beginning of something I could not undo. I did not suddenly become someone else overnight. It started with a call I almost ignored, a number I did not recognize lighting up my phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my desk reviewing a set of architectural plans, and I remember letting it ring once, twice, before answering, expecting something routine, something small, but instead a voice on the other end said, "Is this Isabella Cruz? We reviewed your proposal, and we would like to move forward." And for a second, I just sat there, not because I did not understand, but because I did, completely, and I knew exactly what it meant, because that proposal was not just another project, it was the kind of opportunity people wait years for, the kind that quietly changes everything without announcing itself. And I said, "Yes, this is Isabella," keeping my voice steady even though my fingers tightened around the phone, and he continued, "We want you to lead the full redevelopment," and I glanced down at the plans spread out in front of me, at the months of work I had poured into something no one in Daniel's world even knew existed, and I said, "I understand," because I did, more than he realized, and when the call ended, I sat there in silence for a moment, not celebrating, not reacting, just letting it settle into place, because this was not luck. This was something I had built quietly, piece by piece, without needing anyone to validate it. And later that evening, when I told Daniel, I remember the way he paused, just for a second too long, before saying, "That is great, Isabella," in a tone that sounded correct but not quite real, and I asked, "Do you want to hear more about it?" And he shrugged lightly, setting his keys down on the counter. "If you want to share," and I started explaining, not everything, but enough, about the scale, the visibility, what it could lead to, and he nodded occasionally, but his attention drifted, his phone lighting up on the table, his eyes flicking toward it more than once, and when I finished, he said, "Just do not let it interfere with everything else." And I remember asking, "Everything else?" And he smiled slightly, like I should already know, us, the family, the events coming up, and I nodded because arguing in that moment would have made it something bigger than he wanted it to be, and I could already feel that familiar pressure to minimize, to keep things balanced in a way that never quite included me fully. And the next Sunday, at his parents' house, I almost did not bring it up at all, but his sister started talking about her engagement party, about the venue, the guest list, the details that mattered to her, and I recognized the name she mentioned, not immediately, but enough to make me look up. And I said carefully, "That is an interesting choice," and she smiled brightly. "It is exclusive. You probably have not heard of it." And I felt something shift again, that quiet awareness, and I said, "I might have," and his mother looked at me then, just briefly, before turning back to her daughter. "We are working with professionals on this, Isabella, so everything will be handled." And I let the conversation move on, because correcting her would have required explaining something I was not ready to explain, not yet. And later, as we were leaving, Daniel said, "Just try to be supportive, okay? It is important to them." And I looked at him and asked, "Do you think I am not?" And he sighed softly, like I had made things complicated again. "I just mean, do not insert yourself where you do not need to." And I nodded slowly, because that sentence stayed with me longer than he intended, the assumption that I would be the one crossing a line, that I would be the one out of place. And over the next few weeks, things began to overlap in ways that felt almost deliberate. Meetings scheduled at locations I recognized, emails that referenced timelines that aligned too closely with what his family was planning, and I started to see the full picture forming. Not suddenly, but clearly enough that I could not ignore it anymore. And one afternoon, as I was reviewing final details with a project coordinator, he said casually, "The client is very particular about privacy, especially with the Whitmore event coming up." And I paused, pen hovering above the paper, and asked, "The Whitmore event?" And he nodded, "Yes, the engagement. It is all tied together." And I felt that same stillness settle in again, deeper this time, because suddenly the separation between my world and theirs did not exist the way they believed it did. And when I got home that evening, I found Daniel on the phone, pacing slightly in the living room, his voice lower than usual. And as I stepped closer, I heard him say, "She does not know. And it is better that way." And he turned when he saw me, ending the call quickly. "Just work," he said too quickly. And I looked at him, really looked this time, and asked, "What is better that I do not know?" And he smiled, that same practice smile, "Nothing you need to worry about." And I did not push, not because I believed him, but because I suddenly understood that whatever was happening, whatever he thought he was managing, it was already moving towards something he could not control. And for the first time, I was not the one being left out of the truth. I was the one holding it, and they had no idea, not yet. And as the date of the engagement drew closer, that awareness sharpened into something undeniable, because everything was aligning too perfectly to be coincidence. And I could feel it building, quietly, steadily, like something inevitable, something that was going to surface whether they were ready for it or not. By the time the final week before the engagement arrived, I realized the truth had not just been hidden from me, it had been actively rewritten, shaped into something convenient, that everyone else could believe without question. And the person leading that narrative was Daniel. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the quiet, consistent way he had always managed things. And it started to show itself in small cracks, like the afternoon I walked into his office and heard him laughing with his brother on speaker. "She does not even know how these events work," he said casually, like it was harmless. And I stopped just outside the door, my hand resting against the frame, listening as his brother replied, "So she is just showing up as your +1? And Daniel answered, "Exactly. She will stay out of the way." And I felt something tighten in my chest, not because I did not understand what he was doing, but because I understood it too well. He was positioning me, defining me before I could speak for myself. And when I stepped into the room, he ended the call immediately, smiling like nothing had happened. "Hey, you are home early," he said. And I looked at him and asked quietly, "What do you tell them about me?" And he paused, just for a second before replying, "What do you mean?" And I held his gaze. "Your family, your friends, what do you tell them I do?" And he exhaled, a small, controlled sigh, like I was making something simple complicated again. "I tell them you are focused on keeping things together, Isabella, which is true." And I said, "That is not all I do," and he nodded. "Of course not. But they do not need every detail." And there it was again, that careful line he drew between what I was allowed to be in private and what I was allowed to be in public. And I realized then that this was not neglect. This was design, a version of me that made his life easier, that fit neatly into the expectations of his family without disrupting anything. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it, because it was everywhere. In the way his mother spoke about me to others, "She prefers to stay behind the scenes," she would say, smiling softly, and people would nod, accepting it without question, because why would they not? It came from her, it came from him, it sounded consistent, and I had never corrected it, not once. And the lie grew stronger, with every silence I allowed, every moment I chose not to step forward. And the closer we got to the engagement, the more deliberate it became, like the night his sister stopped by unexpectedly, dropping a stack of invitations onto the kitchen counter and saying, "You are not on the main list, but Daniel said you would be helping, so just arrive early." And I looked at her, at the way she said it so casually, and asked, "Helping with what?" And she shrugged, flipping through her phone. "Just general things, coordination, making sure everything runs smoothly." And I said, "There is already a team for that." And she laughed lightly. "Well, you can blend in. It will make things easier." And I felt that quiet stillness again, deeper this time, because now it was no longer implied. It was spoken, openly, confidently. And when Daniel walked in a few minutes later, I turned to him and said, "Why am I not on the guest list?" And he froze for a fraction of a second before answering, "It is just logistics. Do not take it personally." And I asked, "So what am I supposed to be there?" And he hesitated, just long enough to confirm everything I already knew, before saying, "You will be there with me, just not officially." And I repeated softly, "Not officially," letting the words settle between us, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It is easier this way, Isabella. There is no need to complicate things." And I nodded slowly, because arguing would not change the structure he had already built around me, the role he had already assigned, and in that moment, I understood the full extent of it. This was not a misunderstanding that would be cleared up. This was a reality that had been agreed upon by everyone except me. And the day of the engagement, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my dress, I thought about all of it, every conversation, every omission, every small decision that had led here. And when Daniel walked in, fixing his tie, he glanced at me and said, "Just stay close to me tonight." And I asked quietly, "As what?" And he did not answer right away, just looked at me in the reflection before saying, "As someone who does not need to prove anything." And I held his gaze in the mirror, because for the first time, I realized that was exactly what he had been counting on, that I would not prove anything, that I would continue to let him define me. And as we arrived at the venue, stepping into that bright, carefully arranged space, I could feel everything aligning, every lie settling into place, every assumption ready to be confirmed. And when I walked through those doors and felt the tag being clipped onto my dress, heard his mother's voice, saw the way the room accepted it without hesitation, that was the moment it all collapsed, not suddenly, but completely, because nothing they believed about me was true. And yet everything they had built around that lie was now standing in front of me, undeniable, irreversible, and for the first time, I was not confused. I was not uncertain. I was simply aware. And that awareness was the beginning of everything falling apart. I did not leave that night the way people imagine. There was no dramatic scene, no raised voice, just a quiet walk out into the cold air while the music continued behind me like nothing had happened. And for a moment, I stood on the sidewalk, heels sinking slightly into the concrete edge, breathing in the kind of silence that only comes after something breaks cleanly, and my phone started buzzing almost immediately, Daniel's name flashing across the screen. Once, twice, 3 times, and I let it ring until it stopped, but it did not stay quiet for long, because then the messages started, short at first, "Where did you go?" Then sharper, "Isabella, answer me." And finally, "You are overreacting." And I stared at that last one longer than I should have, because it told me everything I needed to know about how he saw what had just happened, not as a betrayal, not as something wrong, but as something I had misinterpreted, and I slipped the phone into my bag without replying, because I knew that anything I said in that moment would be dismissed, reshaped into something smaller than it was, and by the time I reached my car, the screen lit up again, this time his mother, and I hesitated before answering, not out of fear, but out of a quiet curiosity about what she would say, and her voice came through calm, controlled, "Isabella, you left abruptly." And I said nothing, just listened as she continued. It created some confusion. People were asking questions, and I finally replied, "Were they asking about me or about the label you put on me?" And there was a brief pause, just long enough to acknowledge that she had heard me clearly, before she said, "It was a misunderstanding. We were trying to manage the event discreetly," and I let out a small breath, because even now, she was framing it as something practical, something necessary, and I asked, "So I was necessary as staff but not as family?" And her tone shifted slightly, not warmer, but firmer. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." And I ended the call before she could continue, because I had heard that sentence too many times, in too many different forms, and I knew where it always led. Back to me adjusting, back to me accepting something that should not have been accepted. And when I got home, I sat in the dark living room for a while, not turning on the lights, not moving, just letting the quiet settle around me. And then the emails started, first from Daniel, subject line blank, just a short message, "We need to talk," followed by another a few minutes later, "You embarrass me tonight." And I read that one twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I did completely, and I could see the pattern repeating even here, shifting the focus, reframing the event, and I typed a response, then deleted it, because explaining myself felt pointless, like trying to correct a story that had already been written without me. And then came the message from his sister, longer, more detailed. "I do not know what you were thinking, but you made things very awkward," people noticed, and I almost smiled at that. The way she described it, like the problem was not what had been done, but that it had been seen. And I set the phone down, leaning back into the couch, feeling that familiar weight pressing in, not from their words, but from the realization that none of this was new. It was just finally visible. And the next morning, there was a handwritten note slipped under the door, his mother's handwriting, precise and controlled. "We would like to resolve this misunderstanding with grace." And I held the paper in my hands for a moment, tracing the edges, before placing it on the table. Because even now, they were not acknowledging what had happened. They were managing it, containing it, shaping it into something that could be smoothed over. And later that day, Daniel showed up, standing in the doorway like he had every right to be there, like nothing had fundamentally changed. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been the night before, and I nodded once, not inviting him in, not refusing, just allowing the moment to exist. And he stepped inside, looking around briefly before focusing on me. "You left without saying anything," he said, and I replied, "What was there to say?" And he ran a hand through his hair, exhaling, "It was not meant the way you took it." And I asked, "Then how was it meant?" And he hesitated, searching for something that would make sense. "It was just easier for the event." And I felt something settle deeper inside me, something final, because even now, even standing here, he was choosing the same explanation, the same justification, and I said quietly, "Easier for who?" And he did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything else could have, and after a moment, he stepped back slightly, as if creating space between us. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, and I looked at him, really looked this time, and realized that for him, it truly was not what it was for me, because he had never had to stand in that room and feel himself being reduced to something less than human, less than present. And I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and he waited for me to say something more, to meet him halfway, to give him something he could work with, but I did not, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain, and after a few seconds, he sighed, turning toward the door. "Call me when you are ready to be reasonable," he said, and then he left, the door closing softly behind him, and the apartment felt different after that, not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that made everything clearer. And as I sat there, surrounded by messages I had not answered, calls I had not returned, and words that all sounded the same in different forms, I realized that for the first time, I was completely alone in this, not because no one was reaching out, but because none of them were actually seeing me. And that kind of isolation, the kind that exists even when people are trying to pull you back into something broken, was something I had never allowed myself to feel before. And now that I did, I could not ignore it anymore. The next few days did not fall apart all at once. They just thinned out, like something slowly draining away until there was nothing left to hold on to, and I moved through them quietly, waking up to a phone that no longer felt urgent to check, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold because I forgot to drink it, and for the first time in a long time, there was no schedule to adjust around, no expectation to meet, no voice reminding me to keep things smooth, and it should have felt like relief. But instead, it felt like standing in a room where the furniture had been removed, familiar but empty in a way that made every sound echo. And I noticed how much of my routine had been built around people who were no longer really there. The messages from Daniel stopped after that last conversation. Not completely, but enough, shorter, less frequent. Like even he was stepping back into something easier, something that did not require him to confront what had happened. And one evening his name appeared again. Just a single line. "Are you coming to dinner on Sunday?" And I stared at it for a long moment before typing, "No." And his reply came almost immediately. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." And I set the phone down without answering, because that sentence no longer carried the weight it used to. It just sounded tired, like something that had been repeated too many times to mean anything real. And the silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had. Not sharp, not loud, just absence. And I realized then that I was not just losing a relationship, I was losing the version of myself that had existed inside it, the one who adjusted, who explained, who waited for things to feel balanced again. And without that version, everything felt unfamiliar, even the space I was sitting in. And a few days later, my phone rang again. This time my mother, her voice warm but careful. "You sound different," she said after I answered, and I smiled slightly. Even though she could not see it, different how? And she paused, choosing her words quieter, and I looked out the window, watching the light shift across the buildings outside, and said, "Maybe I am just hearing things more clearly." And she did not push. She never did. Just said softly, "Come home for a few days." And for a moment I considered it. The idea of stepping back into something familiar, something uncomplicated. But I shook my head even though she could not see that either. "I need to stay here," I said, and she understood without asking why. "Then just remember you are not alone," she replied, and when the call ended, I sat there holding the phone, feeling the truth of that and the distance of it at the same time. Because support from afar is not the same as someone standing next to you. And that was what I had lost. Not just Daniel, not just his family, but the illusion that I had a place beside them. And the days continued like that, quiet, steady, almost suspended, until I found myself back at my desk, looking at the project files I had not touched since the engagement. And for a moment, I hesitated, not because I did not want to continue, but because stepping back into that part of my life meant acknowledging that everything else had shifted, that there was no going back to the version of things that existed before. And I opened the file slowly, scanning through the plans, the notes, the details I had built so carefully, and something about it grounded me, not dramatically, not in a way that fixed anything instantly, but enough to remind me that there was something still intact, something that had not been shaped by anyone else's expectations. And later that afternoon, I received a call from the project coordinator, his tone professional but slightly uncertain. "We were not sure if you would still be leading this," he said. And I replied, "I am," without hesitation. And there was a brief pause before he said, "Good, because we have a meeting scheduled at the venue next week." And I leaned back slightly, processing that, feeling that quiet awareness return, the same one that had been building for weeks now, and I said, "I will be there." And when the call ended, I sat there for a moment, not overwhelmed, not emotional, just steady. Because for the first time since that night, something ahead of me felt clear. Not easy, not resolved, but defined in a way that did not depend on anyone else. And as I closed the laptop, I realized that this silence I had been sitting in, this emptiness that had felt like loss, was starting to shift into something else, something quieter but stronger, like the beginning of a space that belonged entirely to me, and I did not know exactly what that would become yet. But for the first time, I felt like I was moving toward something, instead of trying to hold something together that had already fallen apart. The meeting at the venue was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of obligation, but because I wanted the quiet before everything started, the kind of quiet that lets you see a place without anyone else shaping how it feels. And as I stepped inside, the polished floors reflected the morning light differently than they had that night, softer, less performative, and for a moment I just stood there, taking it in without attaching any memory to it, just space, structure, potential. And when the project coordinator walked in, he hesitated slightly when he saw me, like he was trying to reconcile something. "Miss Cruz?" he asked, and I nodded. "Good morning." And he straightened immediately, his tone shifting into something more formal, more certain. "We have the full team ready in the conference room," and I followed him down the hallway, heels steady against the floor, not rushed, not hesitant, just present. And when I stepped into the room, conversations paused for a brief second, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that I had entered, and I recognized a few faces, people I had spoken to over calls, emails, decisions made quietly without needing to explain who I was, because here, I did not have to, and one of the senior managers stood up, extending his hand. "We have been looking forward to working with you in person," and I shook his hand. Likewise, and we moved into the meeting without ceremony, plans laid out, timelines discussed, details refined, and as I spoke, clarified, adjusted, I could feel the difference in the way the room responded, not to me as a person they needed to define, but to the work, the decisions, the clarity of direction. And it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simply respected. And that respect did not come from proving anything in that moment. It came from everything that had been built before it, quietly, consistently, without needing to be announced. And at one point, as we reviewed the final layout for an upcoming event, the coordinator said, "This is for a private engagement hosted by the Whitmore family." And the room did not react. Not the way that name would have triggered something before, because here it was just another project detail, and I nodded. "I am aware," keeping my voice even. And we continued, because for the first time, their world and mine were not separate. They were intersecting in a way that did not require permission. And after the meeting, as people gathered their materials, one of the junior architects approached me, a tablet in hand. "I reviewed your revisions from last week," she said. "The structural adjustments you suggested, they solve a problem we have been stuck on for months." And I glanced at the screen, recognizing the details immediately. "It was a matter of rebalancing the load distribution," I said. And she nodded, a small smile forming. "It is impressive." And I held her gaze for a second before replying, "It is just experience," because it was not something I needed to elevate, just something I had earned over time. And as the room cleared, I stayed back for a moment, looking at the plans spread out across the table, the lines, the measurements, the structure of something that would exist long after this moment passed. And my phone buzzed quietly in my bag. A message from Daniel, "We need to talk, this has gone too far." And I read it once before setting the phone aside, not ignoring it, just not giving it the space it expected, because for the first time, his urgency did not define mine. And as I gathered my things, the event manager from that night stepped into the doorway, hesitating slightly before speaking. "I wanted to apologize for the confusion at the engagement," he said, his tone careful, and I looked at him, not with anger, not with discomfort, just recognition. There was no confusion. I replied calmly, and he nodded, understanding more than I had said. And after he left, I walked out of the building the same way I had that night, but everything about it felt different, not because the place had changed, but because I had, and the air outside felt steady, grounded in a way that did not depend on anyone else's perception. And as I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, I realized that this was what rebuilding actually looked like. Not dramatic reinvention, not sudden transformation, just a series of decisions that aligned with something real, something that did not require explanation or approval. And as I got into my car, starting the engine, I felt something settle into place, not as an ending, but as a beginning that I had not allowed myself to consider before, because the life I had been building quietly, the work I had kept separate, the identity I had never insisted on in the wrong rooms, was no longer something hidden. It was something I was stepping into fully, and the truth that none of them had seen, that none of them had needed to see until now, was about to become impossible to ignore, not because I would force it, but because it was already there, woven into everything they thought they controlled, and they were about to find out, in ways they were not prepared for. The first time my name appeared where it actually belonged, it was printed in clean black letters on a badge that did not need explanation. Not bold, not decorative, just clear, Isabella Cruz, lead development consultant, and I remember holding it for a moment before pinning it to my blazer, not because I doubted it, but because I was aware of what it represented, not just a title, but everything that had been built quietly without needing validation from the people who had once defined me as something smaller. And when I walked into the venue that morning, there was no hesitation at the entrance, no questioning glance, just a simple nod from the staff, "Good morning, Miss Cruz," and I returned it just as simply, "Good morning," because that was all it needed to be. And as I moved through the space, I noticed how differently it felt. Not because the room had changed, but because the role I held within it was no longer something anyone else could assign. And in the main hall, a group of coordinators were already gathered, reviewing final details for the upcoming events. And when I approached, one of them looked up and said, "We were waiting for your approval on the layout adjustments." And I stepped closer, setting my folder on the table. "Show me what you have," and they shifted slightly, making space without being asked, not out of obligation, But because they understood where I stood in this structure, and as we went through the plans, I pointed out a few modifications, small changes that would affect the entire flow of the evening, and one of the junior staff members hesitated before asking, "Would that impact the guest experience?" And I met her gaze. "It will improve it. Trust the structure, not just the surface." And she nodded, taking notes quickly, and there was no resistance, no second guessing, just alignment. And later, as I walked through the ballroom, adjusting details with the team, the event manager joined me, holding a tablet. "We have a request from the Whitmore family to increase the head table capacity," he said, and I paused briefly, considering the implications. Before replying, "That will disrupt the balance of the layout. It is not advisable." And he nodded immediately. "Should I communicate that directly?" And I said, "Yes, and offer the alternative we discussed yesterday." And he made a note. No hesitation, no need to confirm beyond that. And as we continued, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the mirrored panels along the wall, the badge visible against the clean line of my jacket, and for a moment I remembered the other label, the one that had been placed on me without consent. And I felt that quiet contrast settle in, not as anger but as clarity, because the difference was not in the words themselves, it was in who had the authority to assign them, and now, that authority was mine. And as the day moved forward, meetings transitioned into walkthroughs, decisions into execution, and the space began to take shape in a way that reflected intention, not assumption. And at one point, as I reviewed the final lighting adjustments, one of the senior partners approached, extending a folder toward me. "The contract for the next phase," he said, and I took it. Scanning the details briefly before looking up, "We are moving ahead sooner than expected," and he nodded. "Your work has accelerated the timeline," and I signed where needed, the pen moving steadily across the page, not rushed, not uncertain, just aligned with something that had already been decided long before this moment. And as I handed the folder back, he said, "We are glad you are leading this." And I simply replied, "So am I," because anything more would have been unnecessary. And as the team began to wrap up for the day, I gathered my things, pausing once more in the center of the ballroom, looking around at the structure, the precision, the quiet order of something that had been built to hold significance without needing to announce it, and my phone buzzed again, a familiar name appearing on the screen, Daniel. And for a moment I just looked at it, not with urgency, not with avoidance, just awareness. And I let it ring once before answering, "Hello," and there was a brief silence on the other end before his voice came through, less certain than I remembered. "We need to talk." And I glanced around the room, at the work that had been done, the space that now carried a different meaning for me, and I said calmly, "I am at the venue," and he paused. "What venue?" And I let that question settle for a second before replying, "The one you thought I did not belong in." And there was another silence, heavier this time, and I could almost hear the shift happening, the realization beginning to form, and as I ended the call, slipping the phone back into my bag, I knew that the distance between what they believed and what was real was about to close, not because I would force it, but because it could not remain separate any longer. And as I walked toward the exit, the same doors I had once left quietly, I felt the timeline reconnect, past and present, aligning in a way that made everything that had happened unavoidable. Because the moment they stepped back into this space, they would not be able to ignore what had always been here, waiting to be seen. By the time the evening of the next Whitmore event arrived, the venue no longer felt like a place I had been removed from. It felt like a space I understood completely. Every light placement, every table arrangement, every pathway calculated to create a certain experience. And I stood near the main entrance reviewing final adjustments with the team, my badge clipped neatly against my blazer, not hidden, not emphasized, just present, and the event manager stepped beside me, lowering his voice slightly. "They have arrived," he said, and I nodded once, not turning immediately, because I could already feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change in tone when a family like theirs enters a room, conversations softening, attention redirecting, and then I heard it, his mother's voice, composed as always. "Everything looks exactly as expected," and I let a few seconds pass before turning, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge their presence, and when I did, I saw them all at once, Daniel standing slightly behind his sister, his posture more rigid than usual, his eyes scanning the room like he was searching for something he could not quite place, and when his gaze landed on me, there was a pause. Small but unmistakable, like a thought that had not fully formed yet, and he took a step forward, stopping just short of closing the distance between us. "Isabella," he said, my name sounding unfamiliar in his voice, like it belonged in a different context than the one he had placed me in before, and I met his gaze calmly. Daniel and his sister glanced between us, confusion flickering briefly before she spoke. "What are you doing here?" And I tilted my head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement of the question. "Working," I replied, and she let out a small laugh, the kind that tries to dismiss something before understanding it. "Very funny," she said, but her eyes moved to the badge on my chest, and I watched the moment her expression shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. And his mother stepped forward then, her attention sharper now, her gaze settling on me with a level of focus she had never directed my way before. "There seems to be some confusion," she said, her tone controlled, deliberate, and I nodded slightly. "There was," I replied, keeping my voice even, and the event manager approached from the side, his posture straightening as he addressed me directly. "Miss Cruz," did not fit the narrative they had built, and I turned to him. "I will review it in a moment," I said, and he nodded immediately, stepping back without question. And I could feel their attention shifting, recalibrating, trying to align what they were seeing with what they believed. And Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. "What is he talking about?" And I looked at him, not with accusation, not with satisfaction, just clarity. "My work," I said, and his sister shook her head slightly, like she was trying to dismiss it again. "This is our event," she said, and I met her gaze. "It is hosted here," I replied, and there was a difference in those words, subtle but precise, and his mother's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "Explain," she said, and I could hear the expectation in that single word, the assumption that I would fill in the gaps, that I would provide context in a way that made sense to them. And for a moment, I considered it, the simplicity of just saying everything outright. But instead, I glanced toward the main hall, where the lighting had just shifted into its evening setting, the space moving seamlessly into the version they had come to experience, and I said calmly, "Everything here has already been explained." And Daniel took another step forward, his voice tightening slightly. "Isabella, stop speaking like this." And I held his gaze, steady, unhurried. "Like what?" And he hesitated, because the version of me he was used to did not speak this way, did not hold silence like this, did not leave space for him to fill, and behind him, guests were beginning to settle, conversations resuming, the event continuing as if nothing unusual was happening, and that contrast, their growing uncertainty against the steady rhythm of the evening, made everything sharper, clearer. And his sister spoke again, this time more directly. "You are not part of this." And I let that sentence settle, the familiarity of it almost echoing something from before, and I replied quietly, "That depends on what you think this is." And there was another pause, longer this time, because the ground beneath their assumptions was starting to shift, not dramatically, but enough to make it unstable. And the event manager returned briefly, stopping just behind me, waiting without interrupting, his presence a quiet confirmation of something they were not ready to accept. And I could see it in Daniel's expression now, the realization beginning to form, incomplete but unavoidable, and he looked at me again, more carefully this time, as if trying to see something he had overlooked for years. And in that moment, everything slowed slightly, the noise of the room fading just enough to make the silence between us louder, heavier, because the truth was right there, within reach, no longer hidden, no longer separate, and the only thing left was for it to be acknowledged, and I knew exactly what that would mean once it was. The silence stretched just long enough to make every small movement feel louder than it should have. The soft clink of glasses, the distant hum of conversation, the faint echo of footsteps across polished floors, and I could see it in their faces now, the shift from certainty to something else, something less stable, because the version of me they had carried for so long was no longer holding, and Daniel was the first to speak, his voice lower than before, controlled but strained at the edges. "Isabella, what exactly are you doing here?" And I met his gaze without hesitation. "I am working," I said again, not changing the answer because it had not changed, and his sister let out a small, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head slightly. "That does not make any sense," she said, but her eyes kept returning to the badge on my chest, like it was the only detail she could not dismiss, and his mother stepped forward another half step, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now. "Then clarify it," she said, her tone precise, as if this were simply a matter of information, something that could be corrected with the right explanation, and for a moment I considered how much to say, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I understood that once I spoke, there would be no returning to what they believed before, and I glanced briefly toward the event manager, who was still standing just behind me, waiting without interruption, and I said calmly, "This venue, this layout, every detail you are seeing tonight, it is part of a redevelopment project I have been leading for the past year." And there was a pause, not dramatic, but heavy, because the words did not immediately fit into the framework they had built, and Daniel frowned slightly, processing, "That is not what you told me," he said, and I tilted my head just slightly. "You never asked," I replied, my voice even, not accusing, just factual, and his sister's expression tightened. "You are saying you planned this?" she asked, her tone sharper now, and I shook my head once. "No," I said, "I am saying I am responsible for it." And the distinction settled between us, quiet but clear, and his mother's eyes moved briefly to the event manager, then back to me. "That is not possible," she said, but there was less certainty in her voice now, and I nodded slightly. "It is already done," I replied, and behind me, the event manager stepped forward just enough to confirm it without needing to elaborate. "Miss Cruz has been overseeing the entire redevelopment and event integration," he said, his tone professional, neutral but definitive, and the effect was immediate, not explosive, not loud, but precise, like something clicking into place that could not be undone. And Daniel's posture shifted, the confidence he had been holding on to, slipping just slightly as he looked at me differently now, not fully understanding yet, but aware that what he thought he knew was incomplete. "Why would you not tell me?" he asked, and I held his gaze steady. "When would that have mattered?" I said quietly, and he did not answer right away, because the truth was in the question itself, and his sister stepped back half a step, glancing around the room as if the space itself had changed. "This does not make sense," she said again, softer this time, and I watched her carefully, because what she was struggling with was not the information, it was the shift in position, the realization that the person she had placed outside of her world had always been standing inside it, just without acknowledgement. And his mother spoke again, more measured now. "If this is true, then why were you—" She stopped just short of finishing the sentence, but I understood it completely, and I finished it for her. "Why was I wearing that label?" I said, and there was a brief silence, because now we were no longer talking around it, we were looking directly at it, and I continued, my tone unchanged. "That is something you would have to explain." And her expression held for a second before shifting, not to apology, not to regret, but to something more controlled, more calculated. Because even now, she was assessing, adjusting, trying to understand how this new information affected the structure she relied on. And Daniel took another step closer, his voice quieter, more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "Isabella, I did not know," he said, and I nodded once because I believed him, not as an excuse but as a fact. "That is the point," I replied, and the weight of that settled between us, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it was not just about what he did not know, it was about why he did not know, and how easily he had accepted a version of me that required no deeper understanding. And around us, the event continued. Guests moving through the space, conversations resuming, the evening unfolding exactly as planned, except now the foundation beneath it had shifted in a way none of them could ignore. And I could see it in Daniel's eyes, the realization forming fully now, not just about the venue, not just about the project, but about me, about who I had always been and who he had chosen not to see. And for the first time, there was no easy way for him to step back into the version of things that had existed before. And as he stood there, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, the silence between us carried something sharper, something final, because the truth was no longer hidden. And what it revealed was not just unexpected, it was irreversible. The shift did not happen loudly. It unfolded in layers, visible in the way his sister's posture stiffened, in the way her eyes moved between me and the room, as if trying to recalibrate everything she thought she understood, and for the first time, she did not speak immediately. She simply stood there, holding the silence longer than she ever had before, while his mother was the one who recovered first, her voice steady but sharper now. "If this is your role here, then it should have been communicated clearly," she said, and I met her gaze without moving. "To whom?" I asked, and that question landed differently than anything else had. Mart's about information. It was about responsibility, and she held my gaze for a moment before answering, "To the family," and I nodded slightly. "I was not aware that my professional work required approval," I replied, keeping my tone calm, not defensive, just precise, and Daniel exhaled quietly beside her, running a hand over his face before speaking again. "This is not about approval," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. "This is about honesty," and I looked at him carefully, because that word felt misplaced. Honesty requires curiosity. I said, "You never asked what I was building," and he did not interrupt. He did not deflect. He simply stood there absorbing it, and I could see the weight of it settling in, not as an argument, but as something he could not easily respond to. And his sister stepped forward then, her tone sharper again but less confident than before. "So you just let us believe." "What?" she asked, and I tilted my head slightly. "You believed what was convenient," I replied. I did not correct it. And there was a difference between those two things, one built on assumption, the other on silence, and now they were both being seen for what they were, and around us the event continued. Guests laughing softly, glasses clinking, the structure of the evening holding steady despite the shift happening in this small space between us, and his mother crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but contained. "This does not change what happened at the engagement," she said, and I nodded once. "No, it clarifies it," I replied, and she paused just briefly because the distinction mattered, and Daniel stepped closer again, his voice quieter, almost careful now. "Isabella, I did not know," he repeated, and I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of distance that had not been there before. "You did not need to know everything," I said. "You needed to see me," and that landed heavier than anything else, because it was not about the project, not about the title. It was about something simpler, something he had overlooked for years, and he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition. And for a moment, none of us spoke, the silence settling into something more stable, less fragile, because the truth was no longer being resisted. It was being absorbed. And his sister glanced toward the main hall again before looking back at me, her tone quieter now. "So what happens now?" she asked, and I considered that for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer did not need to be immediate. "The event continues," I said. "The work continues." And she frowned slightly. "And us?" she asked, and I met her gaze steadily. "That depends on what you are willing to understand," I replied, and there was no hostility in it, no demand, just a boundary, clear and unforced, and his mother watched me closely, her expression measured. "You are setting terms," she said, and I shook my head once. "I am setting limits," I corrected, and she held my gaze for a second longer before nodding slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because even she understood the difference, and Daniel stepped back then, creating a small distance between us that felt intentional this time, not avoidance, but space, and he looked at me with something I had not seen before, not confusion, not dismissal, but something closer to recognition, incomplete but real, and he said quietly, "I should have asked," and I nodded once, because that was true, but it did not undo anything. And as the moment stretched, the event manager approached again. "Miss Cruz, we are ready for the next phase," he said, and I turned slightly. "I will be there," I replied. And when I looked back at them, I saw that the shift was not fully settled, not resolved, but it was real, and it was not something that could be reversed, and for the first time, I was not waiting for them to understand. I was simply allowing them to decide whether they would, and as I stepped away, moving back into the flow of the event, I could feel their attention linger, not on the role they had assigned me before, but on the one they were only now beginning to recognize, and even then, even with everything that had been said, There was still something unfinished between us, something that would not resolve in a single conversation, because recognition is not the same as change, and I knew that what came next would not be simple, not for them and not entirely for me either. The days that followed did not come with sudden clarity or dramatic closure. They arrived quietly, one after another, like the slow return of something steady I had not realized I had been missing for years. And my life did not transform overnight into something perfect. It became something simpler, something more honest. Mornings where I woke up without rehearsing conversations in my head, without adjusting myself to fit expectations that were never truly mine. And I found a rhythm in my work that felt different now, not because the work had changed, but because I no longer carried the weight of being unseen while doing it, and the project at the venue moved forward exactly as planned. Contracts signed, expansions approved, decisions made with clarity instead of hesitation. And every time I walked through those doors, I did not think about what had happened there before. I thought about what I had built, what I had claimed without needing permission. And Daniel did reach out again. Not immediately, not in the way he used to, but carefully. Messages that were less certain, more measured. "I understand more now," he wrote once, and I read it without urgency, because understanding after the fact is different from seeing in the moment. And when we finally met again, it was not at a family table, not in a space filled with expectation. It was a quiet coffee shop where neither of us had anything to perform, and he looked at me differently, not searching, not defining, just aware. And he said, "I did not realize how much I had reduced you." And I listened, not interrupting, not softening it for him, because this was something he needed to sit with. And I replied simply, "You accepted what was easy to understand." And he nodded, because that was true, and we did not argue. We did not revisit every detail, because the point was not to relive what had happened. It was to acknowledge what it revealed, and we parted without promises, without trying to restore something that had already changed. And his family, they adjusted in their own way, slower, more controlled, invitations that were more formal, conversations that were more careful. But I did not step back into that space the way I had before. I did not return to being something undefined just to keep things comfortable, because once you see yourself clearly, you cannot choose to become invisible again without losing something essential. And over time, I realized that what I thought was loss had actually been separation. Separation from a version of myself that existed to maintain balance for others at the cost of my own clarity. And the quiet that followed was not emptiness. It was space, people's space to rebuild something that belonged entirely to me. And if there is one thing I learned through all of this, it is that people do not define your value by what they say. They reveal it by what they never bother to ask, by what they assume you are without ever looking closer. And your responsibility is not to force them to see you. It is to see yourself clearly enough that their blindness no longer shapes your reality. And if you are listening to this and you feel that quiet discomfort in your own life, that sense of being present but not truly seen, trust that feeling, because your intuition is not loud. It does not demand attention. It waits, patiently, for you to acknowledge what you already know. And whether you call it instinct or faith or something deeper that God places within you, it is there to guide you back to yourself, not to keep you in spaces that require you to disappear. And practically, that means protecting your independence, not just emotionally, but financially, understanding what you bring into a relationship, into a room, into a life, and never allowing convenience to replace clarity, because when you depend entirely on someone else's perception, you lose the ability to define your own position. And that is where quiet damage begins, not in loud betrayals, but in small, repeated moments where you choose not to correct what feels wrong. And healing does not come from confrontation alone, it comes from alignment, from choosing actions that reflect who you actually are, instead of who you have been reduced to. And I am not saying it is easy. It is not. There are moments where silence feels heavy, where distance feels unfamiliar, where you question whether you could have made it work if you had just tried harder. But the truth is, anything that requires you to shrink to survive is not something you are meant to stay inside. And now, when I stand in that ballroom, the same one where everything unraveled, I no longer see the moment I was diminished. I see the moment I stopped accepting it, and on my desk, there is still that badge, the one with my name, simple, unremarkable in design, but clear, and next to it, in a small box, is the ring I slid off that night. Not as something I lost, but as something I chose to release, and I keep them both, not as reminders of pain, but as markers of clarity, one representing what I claimed, the other representing what I let go. And if you have stayed with me through this story, thank you, truly, because sharing something like this is not about proving a point, it is about connection, about knowing that somewhere, someone understands what it feels like to be overlooked, and is learning how to stand in their own space without apology. My name is Isabella. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this: never let someone's limited view of you become the boundary of who you are allowed to be. And if this story resonates with you, if it reflects something you are going through, you are not alone in that. There are more stories like this waiting for you. Stories of quiet strength, of clarity, of people who chose themselves when it mattered most. And I invite you to stay, to explore those stories, because sometimes hearing someone else's truth is what helps you recognize your own.